Good evening. Y'all are here tonight to hear my first ever sermon on marriage. And I'm so qualified to do this from my 7 months of being married, as I'm looking at people, most of whom I believe probably have, most people in this room, I believe, looking around, definitely have more experience and knowledge and wisdom than I do on marriage. So before I preached this sermon, I wanted to give you a disclaimer on why I'm talking about this. First of all, I know, there's biblical wisdom on marriage, obviously, that any of us can go to the scriptures and glean from, right? But also, you can do that just as well as I can. There's biblical advice on marriage that Dennis could give you much better than I could. But I'm preaching on marriage because I was asked to speak on a gospel meeting in Kansas City. It's next week, next Sunday. So Curry and I will be up there. Actually, I'll probably at this same hour next week, I'll be preaching the same sermon next Sunday. And it's a gospel meeting with 3 preachers. So it's a little bit different. We're all young preachers, and so we're going up there to speak. And I am the only person on the gospel meeting who's married. And they wanted someone to preach on marriage. So they decided to ask me, even though I've been married 7 months now, to give all of my great wisdom on marriage. So that's why I'm preaching on marriage, because I had to get it ready, so you're going to have to listen to it. And I can't wait to hear all the critiques afterward that you have for me, whether you are single or married, all of the wisdom that you have to give me. But our title for tonight is, Well. This has to do with a biblical theme about how husbands and wives meet each other. One thing I might actually know more about than many of the married people in here is dating in today's world, considering I have done that much more recently than most people in here. And dating in today's world looks pretty different from what it, I think, has looked like for probably ever. It centers around dating apps and coffee shops and sliding into DMs on Instagram and all kinds of things that are fresh and new in our world. But in the Bible, there is kind of a similar type of theme where a husband and wife meet each other for the first time. But it actually happens around wells a lot, like water wells. So I have to talk about marriage, so I'm not going to try to give you a whole lot of advice, but what I want to do is follow this theme through the Bible, and I think it'll give us some rich wisdom on what marriage means, really deep down, what it's all about. So, take it or leave it. I hope that it will offer you something. But we're going to end up in John chapter 4. So, if you want, you can go ahead and turn there. John chapter 4. Don't get disappointed, because it's going to be a little while before we get there, but just so you can be prepared. But we're actually going to start talking in Genesis chapter 24. This is about Isaac and Rebekah. This is the first love story in the Bible that begins at a well. The story goes kind of like this. So Abraham is getting older, and he has a son, Isaac, and he wants to set Isaac up for the next generation, to carry on the next generation of marriage. So Abraham sends his servant to the land of their ancestors. Remember that Abraham has been commanded to leave where he grew up and go to a foreign nation. So he wants his son's wife to come from his homeland. So he sends his servant back to the land of their ancestors to find a woman who will become part of this family. And this family, remember from Genesis 12, is the family of promise. God has appeared to Abraham and told him, look, your family is going to change the world. I'm going to bless your family so that your family can bless everyone else. So Abraham wants to find a woman to join in on that mission of God in the world. So this servant goes to the homeland of his people, and he gets to a well. And he starts praying that God would make his journey here successful, that he would find a good wife for Isaac. And before he's even done with the prayer, Rebekah walks up. It's just a God thing, we might say. Rebekah walks up, she draws some water for him, and when she learns who he is, she runs back to her family to tell them all about it. The servant comes back with her, and he shares a meal with Rebekah's family, and he stays with them for a few days. And when the servant goes back to Abraham a few days later, Guess who goes with him? Rebekah. Moving very quickly, I guess, but Rebekah commits to go back with this servant to go meet the man who would become her husband. And next thing we know, she and Isaac are joined together in marriage. Well, let's move one generation forward. Let's move to Jacob, Isaac and Rebekah's son. Well, Jacob, it's time for him to find a wife. So guess where he goes? He goes back to the well in Genesis 29. And at least the beginning of Jacob and Rachel's love story looks a whole lot like the love story of Jacob's parents, Isaac and Rebekah. There are some important differences as well, but there are a lot of similarities. So he's traveling and he comes across a well, and he learns from some shepherds that are there that this is the land of his ancestors. So he's back where his father had inadvertently met his wife. And before he finishes speaking with these shepherds, Rachel walks up. And when Rachel walks up, something in Jacob just clicked. Because he basically said, well, and he went to work. He rolled away this stone that was blocking the well that was there, and he draws water for her. He's, I'm sure he was flexing the whole time, just trying to show off his muscles for her. So he somehow woos her. He goes back with her to her family. She runs back to her family with the news of this new Prince Charming. And then he comes and stays with the family, and then they get married. And if you know the story, you know that when the time for marriage comes, Laban, who is Rachel's father, throws this big feast, and some really weird stuff happens, and Jacob ends up married both to Rachel and to her older sister Leah. It's a really long story that we really don't want to get into. But anyway, in the end, Jacob and Rachel do end up married. You might have noticed a lot of those similarities between the stories of Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel. And in case you didn't follow along necessarily, there are 6 similarities that I have up on the screen, I think. Yes, 6 similarities on the screen. So let's go down the list. First of all, someone journeys to a foreign country. Second, a man encounters a woman at a well. Third, someone draws water from the well. Fourth, a woman hurries home to bring the news of the visitor. Fifth, that visitor stays with the woman's family, and someone mentions a meal, thankfully. And sixth, 2 parties are joined as one in marriage. So these 6 threads go through both of these stories. And in case you weren't there in Genesis 24-25, I put together just a quick synopsis from both stories on the screen to read through, skim through the story, and see the threads. So Genesis 24, it says, "Then the servant arose and went to Mesopotamia, and she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her. Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about all these things. So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels. Then food was set before him to eat. Then Isaac took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her." So that's the story of Isaac and Rebekah. One generation later, Genesis chapter 29, "Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. She ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife." So you see that all 6 of those threads are present in both stories. And this could be a coincidence, right? It could just be a coincidence that these stories happen to be close together. They happen to be oddly similar, to have all these threads tying them together. But I think you'll see that this thread continues. And we're just going to point out one other story in the Old Testament where we see just the same 6 things taking place. Because the next person in the Old Testament who finds a woman at a well is the great character Moses. Now, this is the shortest well-meeting story in the Bible. So we're actually just going to read it together. It's going to be up on the screen. It's from Exodus chapter 2. But even though this is the shortest pattern or shortest text with this pattern, it still includes all 6 of those elements. So see if you can pick them out as we go through. It says, "Then Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, 'How is it that you have come home so soon today?' They said, 'An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock.' He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. All right, I'm going to put it back on the screen. The 6 elements of the pattern. So let's walk back through. First one, journey. Moses journeys to a foreign country. Second, he runs into a woman at a well. Actually, 7 women at a well, but he's only going to marry one of them. Third, he draws water from the well for them. Fourth, the women go home soon and tell their father about Moses. Fifth, Moses is invited to dinner, and then he stays with them. And last, but of course not least, Zipporah and Moses get hitched. They get married. So we have these 3 well stories that introduce a husband and a wife for the first time in the Old Testament. It seems like there's something going on with these stories of romance at wells. It seems like these stories have been carefully crafted, carefully portrayed to us to follow a specific pattern. And the biblical authors actually do this a lot. I really wish I could make every sermon kind of like this, where I just follow these nerdy patterns, because it's my favorite thing. We do it a pretty good bit in the Wednesday night class that I teach. But this is all over the Old Testament. This is just one example. But I think if we're going to illustrate what this is kind of like, it's kind of like in scary movies. If you watch horror films or have ever watched a horror film, then you know when that line comes up, and seems like someone always says it, right? They always say, "I think we should split up." You know when they say that, stuff's about to go badly, right? Like, that is not the move. If you're ever in a horror movie, don't split up. That just never ends well. So you know what's going to happen, right? Because this theme pops up, and we know what's coming next. Or if you're into old Westerns, it's kind of like how the sheriff is pretty much always going to have his weapon out before anyone else. He's going to win in the end, right? So it's kind of like that, where you know what's coming next because this pattern is here. Or, one more. If you are into Hallmark movies, I'm not, but I have unfortunately seen 1 or 2, and I know that it's not usually hard to predict when they're going to kiss, right? It always has a kiss in there, and it's not really hard to predict when that's going to happen. It's not supposed to be a surprising tale. It's just supposed to make you feel warm inside, I think. So, you know when that's going to happen, right? It's not really hard to predict. Oh, actually, one more. Kind of like when Arkansas plays Alabama, you kind of know what's going to happen. Oh, sorry. Oh, man. I had to do it. Y'all would have been disappointed in me, honestly, if I didn't do anything. It was a good game. It was a close game, sadly. Sadly closer than it should have been. But when Arkansas plays Alabama, it's just a pattern that happens every year. And for the last 17 years, we know what's going to take place. So, in the same way, ancient authors, like the biblical authors, could communicate that someone was about to meet their wife when they set up a setting like this, where a man comes to a well, and these 6 steps take place. Readers would recognize that this was what was about to happen. So, at a basic level, the well-meeting pattern tells the story of a bond between 2 parties that don't necessarily know each other, but by the end of the story, they're going to be married together as one. One last thing before we move to John 4. Also notice that the 3 stories that we talked about are 3 key figures in the biblical story. You have Isaac, you have Jacob, you have Moses. It's really hard to get 3 more important people to the biblical story than those 3 guys, right? So these are key figures and key moments in the story. It's key figures and moments that move the story forward toward the one that we are going to focus on from John chapter 4. So with that in mind, let's talk about John 4. This is a story of Jesus meeting a woman at a well. And the story begins by following the same pattern that we've seen in the other 3 stories that we've talked about, Isaac and Jacob and Moses. So Jesus, number 1, is journeying toward his hometown, but he passes through Samaria first. So he's passing through this foreign country. And then he runs into a Samaritan woman at a well. Now, John also tells us that it was Jacob's well, which gives us an extra pointer in case we needed it to Jacob and Rachel. And the woman has come to draw water. Jesus asks her for a drink. So at this point, we're following this list, just checking off boxes, right? So at this point, we're just waiting for our save the dates in the mail because we know what's coming next. We know that they're splitting up in the horror movie and it's not going to end well. We know what this pattern is pointing us toward. But this is where this story goes a little bit off the map. It starts to get a little weird. First of all, the Samaritan woman in John 4 makes it clear that this whole thing is going to be an uphill battle. Because look at verse 9. The Samaritan woman says to Jesus, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." So this is going to make this tough, right? First of all, this is very countercultural for Jesus to be talking to a woman in public, especially a woman who's been shunned by her people. I wish we could go into detail on why I say that, but I think it's pretty safe to say this woman is an outcast from her people. And Jesus is talking with her in public. And not only is he talking with a shunned woman in public, he's talking to a Samaritan shunned woman in public. And Samaritans and Jews, as John tells us here, have no dealings with one another. So this is going to be an uphill battle. Whatever's happening here is not going to be easy. Well, then, Jesus drops this line about living water in contrast with the well water that's in front of him. He says that he has living water. And apparently, this magic water permanently quenches thirst. Because look at verses 13 and 14. Jesus says to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water, this well water, will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Now, this is kind of strange because you just asked her to give you water, but now you're saying that you already have water. And actually, your water is better than hers. Obviously, if this is Jesus, right? So we're not going to read this like this. But if we're reading this from someone else, it kind of feels a little bit arrogant. Like, give me water, except I already have water and it's better than the one you were going to give me. It's just kind of weird. It's a weird first date, if we want to put it like that. That's happening here. But then it gets even weirder, because look at verses 16 through 18. Jesus says to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." Now the woman confirms that this is true. And if we're reading this, given the pattern that we know is from the Old Testament, we're just like, no, this is not what's supposed to be happening here. This is not how this situation is supposed to go. Like, this is the point in the first date. If you've ever, I don't know if you've experienced this. I don't think I have, but I have had friends who have snuck a text to get me to call them with an emergency so they can get out of the first date, an emergency, so they have to leave. I'm not going to say whether or not I have done that, but I have had friends who have asked me to do that because the first date was not going well. And this is that moment. This is not what we're expecting to happen in this story. But it keeps going, because look at verse 19. The woman says to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet," because he knew all about her romantic history. She says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." So now here is a doctrinal, theological problem that distances the two from each other. You have, on one hand, there's a Jew and a Samaritan here. There's a prophet, there's a non-prophet, worship here, worship there. There's all kinds of things that are working against this pairing. But this story is not done with its twists, because what comes next is Jesus describing this beautiful bond between his people and her people. But not only that, between everyone on earth who's worshiping God. And this is where we get into probably the most famous passages in John 4. Look at verse 21. Jesus says to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." And then in verse 23, he says that the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. So Jesus breaks down all of these barriers and all of these expectations all at once, because what happens here isn't marriage. In spite of the pattern, this isn't marriage. It's something much more interesting than that. Because what happens here is a profound union of all of us and of all the people that we like and don't like, and the people that we know and don't know, the people that we support and don't support. A chance for all of us to be united at this well. Because what happens here transcends all of those dividers. And this foreign, outcast woman is the first person in John's gospel that Jesus tells who he really is. She's the first person in John who Jesus says, "Look, this is who I am. I'm the Messiah." In verses 25 and 26, read it with me. The woman says to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. The Messiah, the Christ. Messiah is Hebrew and Christ is Greek, so they're the same word, just in different languages. But there's so much packed into this word, just from the Old Testament, from Jewish writings outside of the Bible that go into what the Messiah meant to these people. You can tell just from what she says that this Messiah means a lot, right? He's going to solve everything, essentially, is what she says. Now, Messiah essentially just means anointed one. And people were anointed in the Old Testament, especially prophets and priests and kings were anointed in the Old Testament to carry out a special task for God. And the Messiah, the anointed one, was kind of supposed to fill all of those roles. He was supposed to be prophet and priest and king. And as she says, he was supposed to come and kind of just solve all of the problems that the Jewish people found themselves just strapped down in. That he was going to come and tell us all things, as she says. He's their hero. He's the one that they've been waiting on. And here Jesus says, yeah, the guy that you've been waiting on for hundreds, for thousands of years, that's me. I'm here. And when she hears this, and apparently she's heard and seen enough just to believe him on the spot, she drops the water that she's worked so hard to pull out of the well, and she just runs back into her town, and she tells everyone who will listen about this man called Jesus. So here's the fourth step of this pattern, where she hurries home with the news. But with one big difference, right? Because this news isn't about a man who's come along to sweep her off her feet. It's about a man who's come along to offer everyone a union with him that's deeper and better than anything else they've ever experienced. So, the next step of the pattern, number 5 on this list, I think, yes, the sleepover, aka hospitality. But sleepover is more fun, right? Okay, so hospitality. Now, this is where the text goes next. I think it's verse 40 that says that Jesus stayed with the Samaritans for 2 days. There's the hospitality. And it even mentions food in this chapter. In verses 31 through 34, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, you got to eat something at some point. You've been doing all these things and you got to eat at some point. And Jesus has this line where he says, I have food to eat that you do not know about. And so the disciples are confused. They're like, did he sneak food? Like, did he run to the pantry at midnight and grab something when we weren't looking? They're confused about what's happening. But then Jesus is trying to get them to grasp a spiritual truth. So he says in verse 34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Then he goes into a teaching where essentially he says that instead of feasting at this moment, Jesus says that they're bigger and better fish to fry, we might say. The harvest is ready, is Jesus' point. And then what comes next in verse 39, this is right beside Jesus talking about the harvest. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him. So it seems like John changes the meal element of this pattern to communicate that Jesus' purpose is not to unite himself with this one woman at the well, but to unite all of us to himself. So in the Samaritans believing in him in verse 39, we get a taste, a preview of number 6 on our list when it comes to Jesus in John 4. Because the Samaritans, those people, had found the one for whom they had been waiting. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 29, just one chapter earlier, John the Baptist called Jesus the bridegroom. So Jesus is the bridegroom, but not just of this woman. And actually, the marriage that he's come to offer, the bond that he's come to offer, isn't much of what we would think of as marriage at all. Because when we think marriage, we think one man and one woman for life, right? We know that from Kids Sing, and it's true. That's what marriage is. But Jesus' message to the woman here and to the Samaritans and to us is that he, the Messiah, is offering true life, living water to anyone who joins themselves to him. And actually, if we follow the thread of Scripture just a little bit farther, if we keep going from John chapter 4, we discover that this thing that we call marriage, that is so beautiful in so many ways, done right? It's so beautiful in so many ways just by itself. But what we discover is that marriage is not even only or maybe primarily about itself. Marriage is not so much the end as it is a symbol or a sign, a pointer to how Jesus feels about his people, to the relationship of Christ and his people. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul has been talking about marriage. You've probably heard these texts before if you've been in church really any length at all, where he says, wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives. And he's giving these specific instructions about real life marriage problems. And then in verses 31 and 32, he quotes from Genesis chapter 2. And he says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, like we said, this is from Genesis chapter 2. It's in a specific context, and that context has nothing to do with Christ and the church. At least if you're reading through Genesis 2, you're not going to think Christ and the church. But then, right after Paul quotes it, he says, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Well, no, it doesn't. If you're reading into Genesis 2, that's not what it looks like it's talking about, at least. And also, Paul, this whole time, you've been talking about marriage, like real life, right now marriage. That's why you quote Genesis 2, because it has to do with marriage. But he says, actually, really this whole time, I've been talking about Christ and the church. I've been talking about the relationship between Jesus and his people. And I think what Paul is trying to get across to us is that marriage is about a much bigger reality. It's a taste of a much bigger reality. Because Paul sees marriage as a symbol for the union between God and humans. And if you're married, or if you've ever been married, and this is something that I know even from my 7 months of experience. And I knew this before I got married. And that is that marriage is not perfect, right? If you go into marriage looking to fill up all of your problems, you're probably just going to create more problems, right? So marriage is not perfect here on earth. So it's not that Paul wants us to take all of our problem-filled relationships, not just marriages, but friendships and family members and work relationships, all of the relationships that we have, every single one of which has problems, and say, okay, this is exactly what it looks like when Jesus and his people are together. But I think he wants us to take the best moments, the moments where we really do image Christ here on earth, where we look like Jesus, when I actually have a really good decision, and I love this person more than I love myself. Or really, I love myself by loving this person. And in that moment, I'm experiencing something of what Christ feels for me, of what I feel for him, of this deep, deep relationship that transcends all of our boundaries, all of the problems that you have, that I have, that we bring into every one of our relationships that divide us from each other and always will to some extent. All of those problems, we bring them into our relationship with Christ. But he welcomes us anyway. And he loves us anyway. In Romans chapter 14 or 15, it has this verse that's not going to be up here because I just thought about it, but it sticks out to me always because it's so powerful. But it says, welcome one another as God has welcomed you in Christ. Welcome one another just like God welcomes us in Christ. That's a high calling. That's a high task. It's a difficult duty. But it's what we're called to do. In our marriages, in our friendships, with other family members, in our workplaces, in our schools, we're called to welcome one another as Christ welcomes us in this marriage, this new life that he offers us. I want to end at the end of the Bible. Revelation chapter 19, verses 6 through 10. Because this is kind of the final step, I think, in this theme. It doesn't talk about a well, but this theme of marriage that we've been focusing on. It says, Revelation chapter 19, this is verses 6 through 10. It says, then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude. This is John telling us about an experience that he's had, a vision that he's had. I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters and like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. You and I are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, whether we show up or not depends on a lot of things. First of all, it depends on God's love for you and for me. It depends on his grace. But what we know from the Bible beyond really anything else, if we have to hold on to one thing, we know that God is love, that he welcomes us into this marriage with all of our problems, and he loves us, not ignoring them, but he loves us in spite of them, and he helps us to overcome those problems as we live life with him, as we are married to him in this life. And what we're pointing toward, and what we have really is a save the date. We don't know what date it's going to be, but we know that one day we will be at this marriage feast of the Lamb, where we sit down with God, with his people, with whom we have this amazing, profound union with each other that we don't even know the depth of. But we know that as his bride, as one bride married to him, one day we will sit there with him and have an eternal marriage feast where all of those problems, all of the gaps in us, all the holes that we need to be filled up are filled up once and for all. Where we have a fountain of living water, as it says in Revelation 22, the very end of the Bible. For anyone who thirsts, come and drink from this water of life. That's what we're invited to. That's what marriage, I think, gives us a taste of. And it's what, at its best, marriage points us toward. So I hope that we're all there together one day. I hope that we all sit around this table together and feast. As great as our potlucks are, we need to have another one. We haven't had one in a bit. Now I'm hungry, if you can tell. But as great as those are, what's going to be on that day, what we read about in Revelation 19, is going to surpass anything that we've ever experienced. And so I'm excited for it, and I can't wait to see you there. If you need to take the first steps toward going there, then the first steps are to become married to Jesus. And we do that by following after him, by becoming part of his church, his bride. And we do that by joining in on this life that we're all trying to live, of being his disciples, of believing in him, having faith in him, that no matter what happens around us, he's got us. Because he's our protector, he's a provider, he empowers us to live this life. So if you need to make the first steps to do that tonight, won't you do it as we stand together and sing?
Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you.